Thanks, Patricia. Hi, everyone. This is Alicia Lord. I'm with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and I am currently the webmaster, and so we host over 200 webinars a year, and then I'm here with Ashley Brompton. Ashley, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley Brompton. I'm a program associate at the Vera Institute of Justice Center on Victimization and Safety. And we don't host quite as many webinars, but we host a fair few around disability and domestic and sexual violence specifically.
Thanks, Ashley. I did want to just quickly mention towards the beginning that a lot of this information is going to apply to any online content that you have. So if you're putting trainings on your website or doing a more in-depth training over the course of a few weeks, a lot of this information we've tried to make it general to all online trainings. So I hope you find it relevant. This is our thank you to OVW, our funder. We would not be able to do trainings like this without them. Here are our objectives for today. I'm just going to give you a minute to read those over. We'll be going through an overview of accessibility standards and where they come from. We'll be discussing accessible platforms and materials, and then we're also going to go over how you want to train your presenters and faculty in making sure that they are delivering the information in an accessible way. All right, so participant considerations when you're hosting virtual events. So a lot of these things that we're going to cover are the bottom basics. So these are just things that you want to consider no matter what type of event you're hosting, because you could get access requests for a variety of things as far as interpretation, different formats of materials. And so again, we're just kind of going over the basics with you. But again, this is going to change depending on your audience. Obviously, if you're working with a specifically deaf community, then you're going to have a more specific set of registration instructions, and your format is going to look a lot different. So we're going to discuss a little bit about accessibility standards and where they come from. So the Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act and 504, that's where basically all of the online content access standards come from. It applies to anyone who receives federal funding, so that is all OVWTA providers, but it can also apply to anyone with a large enough audience to determine that it is a public forum. So if you have information that is publicly available on your website, then it's going to need, even if it's not supported by OVW funds, it's still going to need to be accessible. There is a branch of the federal government that is now auditing this. So we just want to be cognizant that you might receive a letter saying, hey, this isn't 508 compliant, and you may need to address it. So all electronic materials need to be accessible. So alt text for pictures, we'll go through a little bit more of that later. Information that is not only conveyed via color. So when you're pointing things out, when you're bringing attention to things, make sure to use more than one identifier, like underlining or bold. You don't want to ever indicate something only using the color red or the color green or any color really. And then captioning of all videos. Again, these are baseline standards. We're going to go into other things more in depth of things that are best practices, but these are things specifically mentioned in 508 compliance. All right, and so we're going to bring up a poll just so that we can better gauge what type of content you guys are used to seeing. In the poll that just came up, please indicate what e-learning or webinar platforms have you used in the past. And we have Adobe Connect, Zoom, GoToMeeting, Beacon Live, or iLink. There's also an other, so if you've used another platform, please let us know in the chat box. Ready Talk, Blue Jeans. Those are interesting. I've heard of Ready Talk. We haven't used it here at the council. Blue Jeans is a new one to me. We'll give you just another couple of minutes. Click Meeting, I believe that's a part of GoToMeeting. So it's one of the services they offer. All right, we can go ahead and close out that poll. Thank you guys. It looks like we have a lot of Adobe Connect, but a good spread around everyone else. We're going to discuss a few of these. I know that cost is like a huge factor when it comes to these, obviously, because we are grant funded. So we're going to go through and we're going to discuss the pros and cons of some of these. Ashley?
Great, thanks, Alicia. So the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is accessible webinar platforms. You all just took a poll that looked at what webinar platforms you already are currently using, and the good news is most of them are already have the features that are necessary. But we really talk about accessibility building from the platform. If you don't have an accessible platform, it's very difficult to host accessible online trainings or webinars. The platform should have built-in access and features, which we'll talk a little bit about in just a minute. And then when you add in assistive technology, for example, the captioning that you see here, and accommodations, screen readers, other sort of accommodations, maybe you have American Sign Language interpreters, and you add in making sure that all of your materials are accessible, making sure that it's an accessible format, accessible resources, and then having accessible facilitation and presentation. All of that together creates the basis of an accessible presentation online. Accessibility really varies depending on which platform you're using. Some of the features are available on all platforms universally, some are not. But really, the more you can customize the user experience on any platform, the better the accessibility is going to be. And so I'm just going to talk about some of the considerations that you should think about when choosing an accessible platform. You should look at published information regarding accessibility. All of these platforms, from Zoom to Adobe Connect to GoToMeeting, all of them have published voluntary product accessibility templates. VPATs, they're available on all of these organizations, all of these companies' websites. And what it does is it lists out all the standards of the Section 508, which Alicia just talked about, and then talks about how the organization complies with those standards in their products. And we'll actually have a list, some links with all of the basic, most common online training platforms and links to their VPATs at the end of this presentation. But it's a really good way to get a quick reference on what features are available on which platforms. Additionally, you're going to want to look for something that has integrated captioning and recording, which we'll talk about again in just a minute. Integrated captioning is really crucial so that individuals who need captioning can see the webinar or online training content and the captioning in the same screen and don't have to go back and forth, which is really important. And integrated recording means that any images, PowerPoints, etc. that you have in your presentation will still be accessible via screen reader, even if it's recorded. If it's recorded through a third-party recording software, that's not always the case. And then thinking about font size, color, contrast of text, all of that should be able to be customized so that an individual user could change the font, for example, the size font of captioning. On Adobe Connect, you can see here that as a user, you can change the font size and customize the color, the background, and the contrast. All of that are things you should look for in platforms. And the more that you can customize, the more that a user can make the platform their own during an online training, the more accessible it's going to be. Some more considerations are screen reader compatibility. Again, that's a big one. You need to make sure that whatever platform you're using, it is compatible with screen readers. And keep in mind that, I know, Alicia, you're going to talk about this in a little bit, but just making sure that it's compatible with the widest variety of screen reader software. There's multiple different types of software for screen readers, and trying to make sure that it's accessible to the most of those options for folks. Another thing is, can you use keyboard commands to manipulate the webinar? As a user, can a user use the arrows to navigate instead of using a mouse click? Someone who has any type of dexterity issue or mobility issue with their hands, it's helpful to be able to use their keyboard, or maybe they have a joystick. Is it compatible with all of those sorts of different features? Does it have the option to have downloadable transcripts? Can a person immediately on site during the webinar download a transcript, or immediately after the webinar download a transcript to be able to refer back to it? Are there multiple ways of communicating with and engaging participants? So for example, here you'll see I'm speaking to you right now, but you also have a chat box where you can type and ask questions. Excuse my dog in the background. Where you can type and ask questions, where you can communicate and engage with participants in multiple formats and in multiple platforms within the platform, so that everybody can use the type of communication that works best for them. Make sure it's as user-friendly as possible. Some platforms are a lot more, you need to have a lot more tech savvy to navigate. Some of them are a lot easier to navigate. The easier it is to navigate, obviously, the better the user experience, even if they don't have a disability or don't need an accommodation, but especially when an individual needs an accommodation, the easier it is for them to access those unique features, the better their experience is going to be. And the biggest thing that we would suggest, and what we definitely do at the Center on Victimization and Safety, is always get recommendations from people that have disabilities or deaf colleagues. We have a wide network of people who work in the field who are really at the forefront of what to look for when you're looking at webinar and online platforms of any kind, because this is what they do. This is what their expertise is in, and they can easily provide you with input around what your specific needs, what can meet your specific needs while still meeting the access needs of your audience. I would always suggest testing the platforms that you're considering, doing a complete test. What we typically do is we bring in an interpreter, an American Sign Language interpreter, we bring in captioners, we do it like we're doing a real webinar and completely test the entire process. We record it, we review the recording, and that way we're able to check every step of the way to make sure that it's accessible all the way along. I wouldn't only rely on that published info that I talked about earlier, because although that provides information on 508 compliance, so it provides information on accessibility compliance for the federal government, it doesn't necessarily promote best practices, which is a little bit more specific and in-depth. I would say the 508 compliance is sort of a floor, not a ceiling, so anything you can do above and beyond that is good. So again, just really talking to people who have done this and have focused on accessibility within their online trainings is really the key recommendation for choosing an accessible platform. And so I wanted to talk about a few critical elements within an accessible platform. These are the non-negotiables. These are the things that you have to have for your webinar or other online training to be accessible to people with disabilities. The first is that your text should be synced with media. So for example, our captioner is relatively keeping up with my pace, and I'm speaking at a relatively normal pace. It should convey speech and non-speech elements. So for example, if there was cheering, it would say audience cheering in the captioning box. That's really important for people who use captioning to really get the entire full experience. And then when we talked about closed versus open captioning, closed means that there's an option to what it seems like to close the captioning so that it doesn't show on the video. Open is where it's burned into the video and you can't turn it off. So when you put it on the website, there's no way for an individual to watch the video without the caption. Typically, our webinars, we use open captioning, meaning that it's burned into the video. There's no way to close it. When you watch the video, the recording, you get the captioning. And then you have real-time versus post-production. Some platforms, such as Adobe Connect, which we're using right now, allow you to do real-time captioning, and the real-time captioning shows in the recording. So you don't have to then do post-production captioning, which is very helpful. It cuts down on post-production costs. Other platforms, you can't necessarily, the video doesn't necessarily show the captioning, so you would then have to go in and do post-production captioning. But it's important to remember that you have to have captioning on anything that's going into your website. Anything that you're recording needs to have captioning on it. That is federal law. That's not negotiable at all. So it's really important to think about your captioning and how you want to navigate that, looking at your budget and your considerations. I'm going to go ahead and just answer questions as I see them, because I think that way it'll be sort of within the context of what I'm talking about. So the first question I see is there a recommendation for how much chat should be used as a way of communicating? I would suggest it's not a great way to communicate directly with the presenter, because presenters are often looking at their PowerPoint, or they're looking at maybe the notes they have in front of them. So it's not always a great way to communicate with the presenter, but tech support people, which we'll talk about later in the presentation, facilitators who are kind of in the background, should be monitoring the chat box and bringing information to the presenter's attention as needed. It's a great way of communicating with each other. So we use chat boxes a lot to start conversation amongst participants. Because when you have a really large audience, it's difficult to use audio. Audio is not always accessible. Even if you have an ASL interpreter, if people start talking above each other, it can be difficult to navigate. So we personally at the Center on Victimization and Safety use the chat box a lot, but not necessarily for vital communication that needs to get to the presenter. But if there's a tech issue or they need to communicate directly with staff who are facilitating the online training, the chat box is a great resource. And then where do you get live captioning from, and is it expensive? There are organizations that do live captioning during webinars. It's not cheap. We spend between $65 and $85 an hour for captioning, but it's a live captioner and you'll want to vet captioners and make sure that they are comfortable with the content that you're talking about, that they are adequately captioning, that they're accurate. But you can find live captioners. There are also organizations and companies that do post-production captioning very accurately. That can be as inexpensive as $1 a word, or it depends on what your particular needs are.
And Ashley, I'm just going to jump in really quick on that question, since we have live captioning for all of our webinars. We pay $100 an hour, but we are fortunate enough to go through a company that has a dedicated team for us, and so they know our content, and getting the materials to them in advance is really, really an important part of that, so that if a captioner is not comfortable with the content, then they have a chance to find you someone who is. And just keeping that line of communication open, I think, is the key part of this.
Absolutely. We also have a dedicated captioning company that we use for all of our captioning needs, and they are excellent. And again, like Alicia just said, building that relationship is really what's important. When you use the same person or the same company for a long period of time, you have a dedicated relationship with them. It really helps just build the continuity of the webinar, keeping the captioning on point, every terminology, people know how to spell it, people understand what it means in context. It just adds a lot to the participants' experience. And we got a question, why use both captioning and an ASL interpreter? This is a great question that we get all the time when we host trainings on access for folks. It really depends. Some ASL speaking individuals, some deaf individuals who use ASL never learn English. So many culturally deaf individuals, English is either a second language or it's not a language that they know at all. Maybe they just only know ASL. So therefore captioning wouldn't work for them because they don't understand English language. American Sign Language is different. It's got a different syntax. It's got a different grammatical structure. It doesn't mirror written English or spoken English. So it's important that American Sign Language interpreters be provided upon request, because someone who is requesting American Sign Language interpreters is typically requesting it because they don't feel comfortable getting the information conveyed to them in written English, which is what captioning is.
And I will
what options are, I'm sorry, go ahead, Alicia.
That's okay. I will just add to that really quick that it's really important to follow up with people and figure out what will meet their needs. So if someone requests ASL or captioning, we follow up with them and say, hey, we have captioning for this webinar. Will that meet your needs? Do you need any other support? And then if they request ASL from there, then we'll go ahead and book it. So just giving people options and making sure that they know that you're going to work with them to make sure they get the information.
It's also really important to think about who your audience is when you're budgeting and preparing for webinars. So if you have an audience where you think there are going to be multiple deaf participants, for instance, our webinars, we focus on disability issues. So we know that a huge portion of our audience is going to have some type of disability. So when we budget for ASL interpreters for every single webinar that we do, and for captioning for every single webinar that we do, live captioning for every single webinar that we do, just because those are requests that we get every single time. So depending on what your audience is and what the content of the presentation is, you'll need to be thinking about that in advance. Some more information about captioning. Captioning isn't only for people who are hard of hearing or deaf. It also helps for people who maybe are at a lower reading level and kind of need to be able to reread information, or people with cognitive disabilities where it's helpful for them to be able to refer back to the transcript for information and to remember and keep track of what's going on. And it really helps every participant. There's always times when you glance down to check an email and then you come back and you miss what something was said, but you can go to the captioning pod and look at the transcript and be able to catch yourself up a little bit. It's helpful, like Alicia said, to provide materials and notes to the captionists prior to the training. We make sure that we always provide at least 24 hours notice, and that is for a captioner that we've used for years. In the beginning, when we were first using captioners, when we didn't have the built-in relationship that we have now with them, we would provide it several weeks in advance so that they had time, like Alicia said, to review the information, make sure that they felt comfortable with it, ask any questions that they had ahead of time. But note that any notes that you put in your PowerPoint presentation, we all as presenters love those little note sections. Those can be read by screen readers, so make sure whatever you're putting in that, you're prepared for the greater audience to see if you're going to have screen readers on the conference. Web recordings should have real-time captioning. So again, just posting a transcript of the presentation does not meet the requirements of the law. You really need to have live captioning. Transcripts are not always accurate. There's oftentimes they're not completely reflective of the context of the conversation. Live captioning is just a lot more accessible for people and a lot easier to follow and understand. So I wanted to show you an integrated versus a non-integrated captioning. So this is an Adobe Connect meeting that we hosted, and we have integrated captioning, which again means that it's on the same screen as our materials. So you'll see our materials are up here and our captioning box is down here. Another example is what you're seeing right now, where you have the PowerPoint right on the left, and then you have the live captioning on the right on the bottom of the screen. That is integrated captioning. One screen, a person can look at the one screen and get all the information that they need. Non-integrated captioning looks like this, where you have the actual conference content, and then you have captioning in another window. While this typically would meet the requirements of the law, it's not very accessible to actual people, and it doesn't, again, you need to make sure that when the recording goes up, the captioning is integrated into the recording, which might not be with the non-integrated captioning here, which means you would be paying for captioning here and then have to go back and do post-production captioning anyway. So also budget-wise, it makes more sense to only have to caption once and have it recorded with the recording content. So, and then another thing is captioning needs to be accurate, and this is another reason why you really need to vet your captioners and have a real relationship with them. Our captioning company we've been using for several years. We have a lot of trust in them to pick the captionist that they believe will most understand the content for that particular training, and that they only use certified captionists. So we avoid a lot of the inaccuracies. If you use something like YouTube captioning, for example, which a lot of people try to use automatic captioning, they're not accurate. You can see here, this is just a screen grab from a YouTube video. You can see what was really spoken: flax, double the vanilla, always double the vanilla, cinnamon, and compare that to what the automatic captioning picked up, which is plaque, double dealing, allowing double the amino for them and, which doesn't even make sense because it's automatic. There's no human looking at the content to make sure it makes sense, and again, not looking at it in advance.
All right, thank you, Ashley. Just one quick funny side note about YouTube captioning. There are a lot of blogs out there that essentially make fun of how bad the captioning is, so if you're ever looking for a funny 5 minutes, I encourage you to look those up, just as an example to give of why you shouldn't use them. I've heard from web people, web developers, that they are the quote-unquote gold standard, and I'm not sure where they heard that, but it's very untrue. And YouTube and Netflix were actually two of the big companies that got sued because they weren't in compliance with the ADA and the Rehab Act. And so, again, it's not just for people who may receive federal funding. If you are deemed a public forum, then this is something that you need to have on your website on any videos. Screen readers are a wonderful software that essentially reads in order all of the elements on a screen. So especially for PowerPoints, it's really important that you build them properly, and we'll go through that a little later. But it will read the title first, and then the first bullet, and then the second bullet out loud to whoever is watching it. Having a platform that is accessible to multiple types of screen readers is really important. You can usually find this information online. If a webinar platform does not state what screen readers it's compatible with, that's usually a good sign that it's just not compatible with any of them, which is never a good thing. It should list it out. That being said, we have worked with a lot of the software companies that we work with all the time to make their software more accessible to meet our needs. So it is worth it if you're using something that may not list the information on their website, to contact them directly and to make sure that it really is not accessible before you move on to something else. They may be willing to work with you. Any questions on that? You can please feel free to use the chat box. All right. Flexible modes of interaction. I know Ashley touched on this a little bit. You want to give people multiple options. So a chat box may or may not be accessible depending on your event. I know there was a question about using it and it being distracting. So I would argue that yes, it may be distracting for really large groups of people where everyone is typing in at the same time. One way to get around that is to use a Q&A box instead. It gives you, at least within Adobe Connect, and I know GoToMeeting does this as well, it gives you another layer of control over what's being broadcast out at any time. So in Adobe Connect, we would just read the questions out instead of having them as a live feed in the chat box. So those are all options for you. The chat box is also something, you either need to have a chat box or a Q&A box up at any time. We have had people where they want to just have all of the phone lines open and have everyone listen over the phone. That's still not going to be accessible for some people. They may not have a microphone on their computer when they're listening. They may not be able to listen at all. They may be relying on captions. And so you want to have some type of mode where they can type in their questions or have any technical issues for you as you're going through the event. As Ashley was saying, it may not be the best way to interact between a presenter and a participant, but again, that is something that you can prep your presenter for beforehand and make sure that they're stopping at different points during the presentation to allow for questions and answers and to allow to go through the chat box. We also do advise that you have a facilitator on with your presenter. It's much more difficult for a presenter to navigate when they're by themselves and they're focusing on their presentation and then also on the chat box. So breaking up those roles a little bit does help. Hand raising and nonverbal cues. So as in this platform, if you guys want to test it out, at the top of your screen there's an icon of a person with their hand raised. You can either raise your hand by clicking that, or you can, just to the right of that, there's a drop-down menu where it would give you different options. So if everyone wants to just test that out really quick just to see. Yay! All right, everyone is raising their hand or giving some kind of feedback. Thank you so much. Those are great little impromptu things that you can do with your audience just to make sure that your audio is coming through well if you're looking for a little bit of insight into them without bombarding the chat box. That's a good alternative. Polling is also a really great feature to facilitate interaction. Generally, the more interaction you can facilitate with a group in multiple different ways, the more accessible your presentation is going to be. With the polls, you also want to make sure that you're reading out the entire poll question and all of the answers, and then summarize what your feedback was from the participants so that everyone, even if they're listening over the phone or they may not be able to attend on a desktop, if they're viewing it on an app, they'll still be able to see what's happening in the room or hear what's happening in the room. Alternatives to VoIP. So again, multiple options are always great. You want to make it so that someone can listen over the computer if they need to, or they have an option to dial in over the phone if they don't have computer speakers or they can't be at their desk watching it. In general, the more options you have, the more accessible it will be. Video sharing, we're going to go into that a little bit right now. First, we're going to look at text and Q&A chat. For screen readers, most screen readers do not automatically read the chat. So we were talking about tabs earlier, so you can tab through the screen. Most screen readers will read whatever you are currently tabbed on. So if you look at our current platform, the screen is broken up into little boxes. So someone can, and that's really for ease of use for the participants, so someone can be tabbed on the PowerPoint presentation and the screen reader can just be reading out that information to them. If they want to tab over to the chat, they can go back and forth, but as you can see, it would be a little chaotic. So whenever there's new relevant text in the chat box, you would want to teach your presenters to read that out or summarize it, depending on if it's a question or just information. This is what the chat box looks like. We have one in our room right now. Again, it's just a running feed. That's a little different from if you want to use the Q&A box. But again, multiple options, and it just depends on your audience, how big your audience is, and what will work for each individual presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about video sharing and how to make it accessible. So video sharing, this is a screenshot of a beautiful, beautiful video. Everyone's super clear. You can see their names. For those of us who have been in a webinar with video sharing, we can tell you that it's usually not like this. For all video sharing, we do recommend that you test and test again beforehand. So if anyone has a low internet service, then video sharing may not even be an option. When it works, great, then it's wonderful and you should encourage people to use it, but if they don't have a strong internet service, then there may not be a point to that. We do use them for interpreters. Again, we have them come into the office when we have interpreters so that when the ASL interpreter is on screen, we have more control over the internet, over the background. We can put a solid background behind them, and we can test everything beforehand. There are ASL interpreting companies that specialize in remote interpreting, so that's certainly something you could look into. But again, I would test everything multiple times beforehand to make sure everything is compatible. And your budget may or may not allow for that. We always have a backup audio line in case the video sharing doesn't work. So personally at our organization, we always have the interpreters on the webcam, and then we have a separate audio line that is used for other things. We never have any presenters, whether they're interpreting or not, we never have them use the video and the audio from their computer because it pulls a lot of bandwidth unnecessarily. So that is just something to keep in mind.
And on that note, I'll say that at the Center on Victimization and Safety, we use one of those remote interpreting companies, and we've used them for several years, and our results have been typically good. We have, they have solid backgrounds, they have bandwidth, they know a lot about how to maintain bandwidth, they have very strong internet available. So because so much of our center is remote, we don't have necessarily a standalone office where people could come to interpret from the office. Also, as a general practice, we do not have any video for any of our presenters ever unless they are deaf because they're signing. We only have video for our ASL interpreters, and the reason for that not only is bandwidth and internet connection, like Alicia mentioned, but also it's very distracting to have too many videos on the screen with the PowerPoint and a lot going on. And the videos look very small on a lot of these. The more people that you have on video, the smaller the video looks. And then someone who is deaf and needs the interpreter might not necessarily be able to see the interpreter if there are a bunch of other people on video. So we try to limit the people on our webinars and online trainings to those who just are interpreters or are deaf presenters who need to be able to sign in order to communicate to the interpreter. And we've had relatively good success with that, as good as you can with technology, which we all know sometimes doesn't cooperate. And with that, we're going to talk a little bit about what to do when that happens and some of the behind-the-scenes stuff that you should be thinking about. The first thing is we always have at least 2 staff members on every webinar that we do, and that does not include anyone who's presenting. That is just the background staff. So we always have a tech support person who is a dedicated individual who takes in all of the technology issues that are happening, who manages our question and answer and chat boxes, and who makes sure everything is kind of running smoothly. And then we have another staff person who is the facilitator, who comes on and introduces the accessibility of the platform, the different features of accessibility, introduces all of the presenters, and provides some context for folks. So we have a standard introduction to all of our online trainings that does an overview of all of the various aspects of the platform, including question and answer boxes, chat boxes, if there's going to be polling, captioning, video interpreting, or other accessibility features. Actually, we created a video for our webinars that we play starting about 10 minutes before our webinar starts. We play a video that goes over all of the access features of our particular platform. And then when the facilitator begins the webinar, they again reiterate, and then they test the technology with the participants, making sure the participants can see the captioning and see the interpreter if there is one without issue. So we always do that just to make sure that for that particular day, at that particular instance, technology is working for us. The facilitator and the tech support should understand the accessibility features of your platform. They should know how to work them, how to help individuals access them, and should be able to be a resource for folks who have questions on how to use the features presented. Again, introduce all presenters and facilitators. It helps people to have context and to know who's doing what and who the voices are that they are hearing, especially because we don't use videos. If there are any technical issues with the captioning, or in our case, we typically use ASL interpreting, we pause the webinar while problem solving those issues. You do not continue the webinar if there is an accessibility issue. If you've had someone request captioning or you're using captioning, you need to make sure that captioning is working for the webinar or the online training. If it's not, you should not continue that training until you're able to solve the issue. This can be really difficult and can lead to some serious decisions that have to be made. We've had to cancel several webinars in the past when, for example, our American Sign Language interpreter had a connection issue and just could not get his video working. We had to cancel it because we had participants on who could not actively participate in the webinar without ASL interpretation. We've had a similar issue before with our captioning, where our captioner just could not connect, and so we had to reschedule the webinar. Those are things that come up, and it's never a pleasant situation to be in. We personally have found with our audience that they are appreciative of us setting a standard and sticking to it, and really being vocal and communicative about the situation. If we are experiencing technical difficulties, we'll usually put a note on the screen so that individuals know what's going on. We'll make periodic announcements of the status of whatever we're working on, and typically because we're all so familiar with the platform and with the accessibility features, we're able to resume within 10 minutes, and if we can't, we will go ahead and call it and cancel it, and then reschedule it for another day. And those are hard decisions that you have to make, but when you really value access, it's something that you really need to take a stand on. So some considerations for presenters and facilitators. So the way that the Center on Victimization and Safety kind of structures our online trainings is we always have a facilitator who is the person who at the beginning of the webinar or online training will do the introduction, will kind of talk to folks about the accessibility features, will introduce the presenters, and then we have presenters. And so we always want to make sure that we are training all of our facilitators and all of our presenters on access and the things that they need to be thinking about when they're doing a presentation. So for example, for interactive components, for example, if there's a poll, you want to verbally ask all questions and describe all content. So if you have a poll, for example, you saw earlier that when Alicia did her poll, she read it out loud and read all of the options for people out loud. And similarly, when I was looking at the chat box and answering questions from the chat box, I was reading those questions out loud. That's just a way to ensure that everyone has equal access. For example, if their screen reader isn't reading the chat box, as Alicia said before, it might not always read the chat box. They're still able to be up to date on what's going on. And the same thing is if you have an interactive exercise, if you have a whiteboard where people are contributing information, you want to make sure that you're verbally recapping all of that so that people who can't see it can still keep up with the information. You want to tell your presenters and facilitators to be aware of their pace when speaking. Typically, we suggest just talking at a normal pace. You want to make sure people aren't speaking too fast, but you also want to make sure people aren't speaking too slow. Sometimes presenters, especially if they're dealing with ASL interpreters for the first time, will talk very slow because they think that they need to. And what it does is it just creates an appearance of sort of a disjointed presentation. It doesn't go as smoothly. It seems off to people who are hearing. The interpreters don't really know how to process that. They're not used to it. So typically we just say, you know, speak at a normal pace. Don't speak too quickly, but make sure you're not, you know, slowly speaking just because you're worried about the interpreter keeping up. The interpreters are trained and they can keep up. The captioners are trained. So just speak in a normal pace. And then we always have our presenters send materials in 2 weeks in advance. And we have them send it to the host of the event, which is typically a staff member who also acts as the facilitator. That person will then make sure that all of the content is accessible, which Alicia is going to talk about a little bit later, what that looks like. Making sure that the PowerPoint presentations are acceptable, making sure that all of the language is appropriate, making sure that all of the pictures have alt text, that links are appropriate, and we just have that. Also, we can then send the PowerPoint and other materials to the ASL interpreter and to the captionists in advance, which they always appreciate as well. And then some other tips, always, always, always conduct practice sessions with your presenters, especially if they're going to be on camera, if it's their first time using that platform. We have presenters who have used our platform for other meetings and other things, and typically with that we'll just, you know, say, can you log in half an hour early and make sure everything is good. If it's a presenter who's not familiar with your platform, you definitely want to schedule a session a few days beforehand to check audio, make sure they know how to connect their audio. We have all of our presenters have the system call them. Our experience with certain platforms is that the voice over IP audio is not always as good. Again, that depends on the platform. The platform that we use, we like to have people call in or call out. We want to make sure they know how to do that appropriately. We want to make sure that if they're going to use video, they know how to use the video. We want them to know the setup, where the interpreter is, where the captioning is, and then some of the behind the scenes, like where the presenter chat is, where they can talk to each other, things of that nature. We like to orient all of that in advance. And then typically we test our captioning and interpreting service. We don't do this before every webinar because we host so many webinars, but we do periodically make sure that our interpreting and captioning services are working appropriately, that there's no issues with the system or with the agencies that we use. So that's just kind of periodic, almost maintenance on our captioning and interpreting services. And then we instruct presenters on accessibility features in advance. We also talk to them about accessibility within their presentations themselves. So we make sure that all of our PowerPoints for all of our presenters are accessible, but we also go over those changes that we make to make them accessible with presenters so that they are aware of what needs to happen in order for a presentation to be accessible. And we go over all of the implications that that might have. We let them know that we send out PDF versions of their PowerPoints in advance to those who request them. And then some of the other accessibility features that we have. So really, it's just, again, about building relationships with people, having open communication, and really just being clear on your expectations and what you're trying to do.
All right, thank you, Ashley. One more thing about tech issues and when you run into those, I want to reiterate that it is okay to push pause, to cancel or reschedule a training. I know that really panics a lot of people and they want to keep to their schedule, but sometimes, you have to allow that technology is just technology. It's not perfect. It's wonderful when it works, but it doesn't always. And so, just last week we had a tech issue and we had to stop it halfway through and restart everything and hope it worked. Thankfully it did and we were able to continue, but allow yourself that in case it does happen. All right, going into accessible presentation. So we're going to talk now a little bit about your materials and things that you can do beforehand to make sure things are accessible before you get to the platform itself. So these are a list of features that you should just be building into your materials, whether they be PDFs or PowerPoints or resource lists in Word or anything like that. Your font type and style should always be sans serif, not serif. So serif fonts are the ones where they have like a little curve at the end. They're harder to read. If you use those types of fonts, they're just, they tend to mush together a little bit more, so people with low vision have a harder time reading it. Text size, we say 22 or higher for any presentation online, but you may want to go bigger. It just depends on what platform you're using and how much of the screen you're allowed to take up with your presentation. I have seen platforms, especially ones like iLink, where the presentation itself is very small, and so you might need to increase the font size to accommodate for that. Contrast, you want to go for the biggest contrast you can between colors. So if anything looks remotely similar or you have a light gray on white, then you're going to want to darken your font so that you have enough contrast so that it's legible. There are contrast checkers online, and they are listed in the back of the PowerPoint, so you can download the materials box and get links to all of these kind of helpful tips. Video and audio should be captioned in advance. So that's for accuracy purposes. So while we love live captioning and it's very convenient, it's not 100% accurate. So So if you have a video you would like to show, if you have an audio clip that you're going to be using during your training, you have the ability to caption that in advance. So you can go through a post-production captioner. There are online tools that will help you develop a transcript and then embed it into your video. Again, there are links to those types of resources at the end of the PowerPoint, so you have access to those. But it should, to the best of your ability, be captioned before you use it in your presentation. Transitions and animations. I know we all love using these things and making our PowerPoints, more fun or what we perceive to be more fun, but you really shouldn't use them when you're doing online training for a couple of reasons. One, they can't be read by a screen reader, and so you're not creating an equal experience for people who can't see your screen. And then also, for people with low vision, it does make things run together, and it can be distracting. So we just advise that you don't use those at all. Use pictures to illustrate concepts with alt text. So we're going to go into alt text a little bit more in a second, but pictures are great. You don't want to shy away from pictures when they're relevant. Make sure the picture is relevant to the concept that you're actually talking about. Having a picture of a flower on a slide that doesn't talk anything about flowers or anything like that doesn't really make sense. So make sure that they are relevant and make sure to include alt text. Unique slide titles. I know this one's difficult. If you notice throughout our presentation, you'll see like a number 1 or a number 2 next to different slide titles, and that is to distinguish between them. So a screen reader, when it's reading through a PowerPoint presentation, it essentially won't be able to tell the difference between different slides if you don't have different slide titles. And that is a feature that is built into PowerPoint that the screen reader uses. So making sure that each title on each slide is a little different definitely helps with readability from a screen reader perspective. Also make sure that you have slide titles. I know that sometimes we'll get presentations where it will just be a picture on the slide. It doesn't have any title. You generally don't want to do that either because, again, the screen reader won't really know how to navigate it. You want to make sure that there's the first thing that the screen reader will read and then your content so that it has context. Again, just go for simple, clean, and readable. We want to make sure this information is accessible to the widest range of people. All right, so again, you want to make sure that these are easy to navigate. So one way to do that is to number your slides. There are a bunch of different ways or a bunch of different templates where this isn't necessarily built in, so we would advise that you use a template where the numbers on the slides are built in. If you have pictures or anything that will go over a slide number, it's not necessarily bad, but you want to make sure that that doesn't happen on all of your slides so that you can navigate it, and you still want to make sure that the number is there so that the screen reader will pick it up and not lose where you are at in the presentation. We've seen this issue come up a lot in when you're merging presentations. So sometimes, multiple people are working from multiple versions of PowerPoint, and they'll all send you 4 or 5 slides, and you have to merge them together. And then when you go to add page numbers after that, they're all out of order. So one, we would suggest that you just open a new presentation, but you can also use the arrange feature in PowerPoint to move things around so that it makes more sense. I do see a question that came up, Katie, how can we test to see if the PowerPoint is screen reader compatible? I will get to that in just a couple of slides, but in newer version of PowerPoint, there is a checker built in. And Irene's asking about the rearrange feature. So the rearrange feature allows you to make sure that the reading order of the slides is correct and that the reading order on the slide itself is correct. So you can do both. And it is found in one of the options panels in PowerPoint, but we can send you that information afterwards. Hi, Rama. She's asking, how do we insert page numbers? So again, this is one of the features in your options. If you go to your master slide page, it will let you insert page numbers into your presentation and change the font size and all of that good stuff for all of your slides so that you don't have to do it by slide. So again, that's something that we can send you afterwards if you want a further breakdown of a how-to. So alt text. Alt text is very, very important anytime you use an image. So this is just one of our sample images that we've used on a project here at the council. And this, you need to type in for this picture exactly what it is, and that's what a screen reader will read to the participant if that's how they're watching. So they need to be brief and they need to be relevant. So you can make the argument that you can have too much description for a picture, essentially, because you really just want it to read what is relevant to the content about the picture. So for this one, we would write black and white picture of 3 sets of hands cupping a small house, smallest hands on top, largest hands on bottom. And that would give someone the idea of multiple people holding a little house and it is about safe housing, kind of a thing. So you want to make sure that it's relevant, short and sweet. So this is the accessibility checker that is built into PowerPoint, as Katie was asking about. So if you have PowerPoint 2013 or newer, it is built in. So if you open PowerPoint and you go to File, the second option down says Check for Issues, and if you click the drop-down on that, you can check for accessibility. This will test your reading order. It will see if you have any alt text that is missing, any title slides that are missing. It's a really, really great tool that we do suggest that you use for any of your presentations. It does not check for contrast. That is one thing that you do need to be aware of. So if you have something that is technically, it's very grayed out, that's kind of a judgment that you need to make at that point and make sure that the contrast is there. There are online contrast checkers, again in the links at the end of this PowerPoint, that you can insert a screenshot essentially, and it'll tell you if it has enough contrast or not. So this is kind of just an example of what issues you might find using the accessibility checker. When you click on each one of these issues, it will give you instructions for how to fix it. It doesn't just point them out and then, hey, you go figure it out. It will give you exactly which picture is missing alt text, and it will give you explicit instructions on how to add that. And then the reading order as well. So the errors themselves are things that you definitely need to address. The tips may be something that it just doesn't appear right with how the template in PowerPoint is laid out, and you may just need to check it, or it may be something that you actually need to go and fix the reading order on. So I know it says tips, but please do click on those to make sure that everything in there is in the correct reading order for a screen reader. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on checking PDFs just because it gets really, really complicated. So in Adobe Acrobat Pro, you can check a PDF for accessibility as well. Adding accessible features to Adobe Acrobat is also a little more complicated than it is in Word or PowerPoint. So we do just suggest that you build it excessively initially so that by the time you PDF it and send it to people, it's already meeting those standards. These are all of the different options that you have within Adobe PDF. It checks for alternative descriptions, which is alt text. Text language is specified so that if someone's reading your PDF with a screen reader from a different language, it will be able to update that. Character encoding, content is contained within the document structure. Again, those are for screen reading purposes to make sure that it's reading the information correctly. Form fields have descriptions. Again, that's for when you're filling out a fillable PDF. Tab order is consistent. That's reading order. List and table structure is correct. So when you're creating a table, I wanted to leave this in here because when you're creating a table in Word or Excel, if you build it using the table creator, then it will establish that reading order for you before you PDF it. But if you do not build it using the tab creator within those programs, you would have to add it later, which is much more complicated. So when you're building a PowerPoint or a Word document or even a table, make sure you use the features and the templates that are already built inside those programs, and you're more likely that those will already be accessible to a screen reader by the time you get to use them in your presentation. All of these standards, all of the things that these check for come from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I know that we were talking about the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 508 of the Rehab Act, as kind of like a floor for where you need to start in terms of accessibility, but anything that's posted online, there is another set of guidelines that is a better best practice to shoot for, and there are links to that in the presentation as well, and they're called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and we are on version 3.0 right now. They include anything that's been addressed in case law, as well as screen reader compatibility and any other standards that they believe should be universal across the board for web content. We here at the Council have agreed that webinars and online trainings do count as website content because one, it is an online feature training, and then two, everything that we do is eventually posted on our website. So it is better to just start planning it accessibility from the start. All right.
Alicia, can I just add something here really quickly?
Yes, of course.
I just wanted to add that it can be very difficult to figure out accessibility on PDFs and PowerPoints. I know when I first started doing this, it took me a really long time. My biggest suggestion would be to go in and play with them and just start figuring things out. Really, that was the best way for me to learn how to do it, is to just go in and start looking at the different features. They have really great tutorials on their websites as well, on like the Microsoft website. That can be really helpful. Adobe has tutorials as well for PDF, but just go in and start playing with things and see how it works out, because that's really the best way to learn. And there was a question really quickly, when webinars are recorded like this one, can screen readers still read the PowerPoint even though it's converted to a video file? They can still read the PowerPoint. So that's one of the features that you want to look for in a platform, is that the screen reader can read the PowerPoint presentation as well as the rest of the stuff going on. That's the issue with third-party recording software. So some organizations will, like, for instance, be doing this on Adobe Connect, but record using a third-party recording software. The issue with that is that then the PowerPoint is not screen reader accessible. Here, when you upload the file, it becomes the system reads the file and is able to convert it for screen readers. So I just wanted to add some tips on how to kind of orient yourself to making accessible materials, because I don't think it's necessarily easy at the beginning.
Thanks, Ashley. It's definitely a process. Conrad asked, am I the only one finding Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0 online? So they just released 3.0, so I don't know that it's been built into the software yet. So 2.0 is very recent, so I wouldn't discount it. You can use those guidelines as well. All right, we will just give a couple more minutes for people to type in any questions they may have. These are the documents that we have listed in the materials box. So Vera has a planning and hosting accessible webinars tip sheet that is listed in the webinars or in the materials box. And then we also have an accessibility tip sheet for webinars that focuses a little more on the how-to of it. So depending on what you're looking for, you can download both of those documents. So Raman's asking, can you give examples of sans serif fonts? So the ones that we're using right now are sans serif. So Arial is a sans serif font. You notice it's very blocky. Calibri is also a sans serif font. You want to stay away from an example of some serif fonts are Times New Roman is a serif font. Franklin Gothic Book, thank you Irene, is a great sans serif font. That is what we use for all of our products here at the council. Ashley, what do you guys use? Do you have an exclusive preference?
We use Avener and Arial.
Okay. So yeah, just stay away from things like Chiller or anything that's cursive or, you know, trying to look really pretty. Those are generally not going to be accessible. Georgia is also a one that is a serif font. All right. So I'm just going to go through and show you the rest of these links so that you kind of have an idea of what's in the rest of the handout. These are all links to just help you navigate through online resources. So the one at the bottom here is going to be PowerPoint accessibility. So people who are having specific questions on how to navigate making the PowerPoint accessible, you can click on that one and it's a great resource. These are all of the platforms where they have their access information online. Notice that meeting one is not on here. It's generally not a very accessible platform, so I apologize to those who are using it. It's not accessible to screen readers. It doesn't have any integrated captioning options as of right now. So again, we have had luck with contacting these types of providers and getting them to kind of work around our needs. Meeting one is a big one though, so I'm not sure if you would have any success with them, but it is worth reaching out to your contact there and seeing what they have to offer in different platforms. So Raman's asking, will you tell us if our trainings are not accessible? So Raman, Rahman, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're with Karama, correct? Who is a TA provider? Yes. So I've worked with you in the past. So for all TA providers under OVW, your answer is going to be a little different. So if you are a grantee of anyone, then you can contact Ashley, and they'll kind of direct you to the correct people to help you with any access questions you may have. And I'll put our contact information back up here. If you are a TA provider, and whether you use the TA to TA service or not, you can send us materials or any webinar online platform related questions, and we can check those for you. So Rahman, specifically for your organization, we do check your materials before we upload them to the Adobe Connect platform, because I believe we host all of your webinars. And yes, we would tell you if something was really terrible and we needed to correct it. Thank you. All right, Ashley, did you have anything else to add?
Nope.
All right, thank you everyone for joining. Our contact information is on the screen. Please feel free to reach out if you have any further questions. I see someone's typing, and so I'll let you continue typing. But I will say after this webinar, you will be directed to an evaluation to let us know. Carrie just says thank you. Thank you, Carrie. To let us know how we did with the webinar today, and let us know of any other content you'd like to see us present on. If you need a certificate of attendance for today's training, also at the bottom of that evaluation is a request for you to fill out. So thank you all for joining us today, and have a great rest of your afternoon.